Welcome to the Path Study 103, Understanding the Path Study Weights. Thank you for joining us today. Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the author only and do not necessarily represent the views, official policy, or position of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or any of its affiliated institutions or agencies. A link to the Path Study User Guide is available in the YouTube video description. This presentation is supported with federal funds from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the Center for Tobacco Products, CTP, Food and Drug Administration, FDA. Department of Health and Human Services under contract to Westat, contract numbers HHSN 2712 0110 0027C and HHSN 2712 0160 0001C, and through an interagency agreement between NIH NIDA and FDA CTP. We will begin with an overview of the key features of the PATH study. Each line in this timeline represents the beginning of a data collection for each wave. This contract was originally awarded in 2011, with field testing starting in 2012. The PATH study began Wave 1 data collection from adults and youth in 2013. Waves 1 through 4 collected data from adults and youth every year through 2018. Wave 5 was the start of biennial collection. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Wave 6 data collection started in March 2021, and Wave 7 data collection began in January 2022. There was also a special collection of youth data in 2017 to 2018 and youth and young adult data in 2020, and a special collection of adult data in 2020. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, Wave 5.5 and the PATH Adult Telephone Survey, ATS, used telephone interviews. Wave 6 and 7 utilized mixed-mode data collection, with telephone interviews and in-person interviews. Wave 1 collected blood and urine samples, and Waves 2 through 5 and 7 collected urine samples. Future waves of data collection are planned for 2023 through 2024. This presentation will cover weights available in Waves 1 through 5 of the PATH study. It excludes the special collections of Wave 4.5, Wave 5.5, and ATS, as well as Waves 6 and 7, which will be released in the future. The PATH study is a nationally representative longitudinal cohort study of tobacco use and how it affects the health of people in the United States. PATH study is designed to support the FDA Center for Tobacco Products, CTP, regulatory activities. More detailed information on the PATH study design and how to access the data can be found in the PATH Study 101 and PATH Study 102 webinars, respectively. The longitudinal design of the study allows researchers to track tobacco product use and changes over time, including product initiation, cessation, and relapse. Because the interview asks about a large array of different products, researchers can investigate poly-tobacco use, switching between products, the emergence of nicotine dependence, and other health conditions that may be related to tobacco use. Measures also include regulatory domains and mediators and moderators. The PATH study also collects biospecimens from respondents, some of which are analyzed for biomarkers of exposure to various toxicants and biomarkers of potential harm. Because the tobacco market is continuing to evolve, the longitudinal nature of the PATH study allows researchers to track not only changes in product use, but also changes in awareness, knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs about tobacco products from wave to wave, overall, and by subgroup. The PATH study uses a longitudinal cohort design. Those recruited into the study at Wave 1 comprise the Wave 1 cohort. The Wave 1 cohort is made up of 53,178 people, including adults ages 18 and older, youth ages 12 to 17, and shadow youth ages 9 to 11 who complete their first interview when they turn 12. The sample includes never, current, and former tobacco users. Wave 4 is a replenishment wave, meaning we recruited an entirely new set of respondents to complement the respondents recruited at Wave 1. The Wave 1 cohort was replenished with a probability sample of adults, youth, and shadow youth aged 10 to 11 from the civilian, non-institutionalized population, CNP, at the time of Wave 4. This replenishment sample is designed to supplement the Wave 1 sample. It is not intended to be used for estimation purposes on its own. When combined with the respondents from the Wave 1 cohort, the replenishment sample ensures that the Wave 4 cohort represents the civilian, non-institutionalized population at the time of Wave 4. This illustration highlights the overlap between the Wave 1 cohort and the Wave 4 cohort. The replenishment sample just described is illustrated by the green and yellow bars. This illustration is also available in the Path Study User Guide. This table provides interview sample size and response rates for the first 5 waves of the Path study. The response rates over the course of the study have been quite high, ranging from 65% for the Wave 1 cohort responding at all follow-up waves through Wave 5, to 88% of adults in the Wave 4 cohort responding at Wave 5. In addition to response rates, this table also shows the overall sample size at each wave. As you can see, for the Wave 1 cohort, the sample size for adults and youth was diminishing at each additional wave. This decrease over time, although small, is normal in a longitudinal research study due to attrition and the aging up of youth and shadow youth. The planned replenishment at Wave 4 helped to increase the sample size for subsequent waves. This section will discuss the sample design and how a complex sample design must be taken into account when analyzing the Path study data. The Path study uses a 4-stage, stratified probability sample design. The first stage of the sampling process was to select primary sampling units, which for the Path study are counties or groups of counties. The second stage was to select segments, which can be thought of as neighborhoods within the primary sampling units. The third stage was to select street and residential addresses within the segments. Once a residential address was selected, a field interviewer was sent to the address to complete the fourth stage, which was to select participants. The selection of adults involved a 2-phase screening procedure. The resident the field interviewer first interacts with is referred to as the household respondent. The household respondent reports on the tobacco use of all adults living in the household. Step 1 of the screening procedure selects an initial sample of adults for the household. Step 2 of the screening procedure asks these adults about their own tobacco use, since the household respondent may not know about all tobacco use behavior for each household member. Then, the final sample of up to 2 adults per household is selected. The Path study oversampled adults who used tobacco, young adults 18 to 24 years of age, and Black African American adults. Additionally, up to 2 youth ages 12 to 17 were selected at random per household. A shadow sample of youth ages 9 to 11 was selected to be interviewed at later waves, and more youth and/or shadow youth could be selected in households with multiple birth youth. There is no oversampling for youth. Population and replicate weights were created in order to adjust for the complex study design characteristics, such as stratification, clustering within primary sampling units, and oversampling. These weights were also adjusted for non-response at each wave. When analyzing Path study data, it is necessary to use the weights to produce results that are nationally representative of the U.S. civilian, non-institutionalized population ages 12 years and older. If the weights are not used, results will represent the sample and not the population. Special analytic techniques are needed to use the weights. These are described in the Path Study User Guide. Specifically, analyzing complex sample designs requires special techniques to produce accurate point estimates and appropriate variances, for example, standard errors. Without employing the correct analytic techniques, one or the other of these will be incorrect. Next, we will describe at a high level how using the Path study weights ensures accurate point estimates and standard errors. Using the correct weights will produce accurate point estimates that will allow you to say that your results are nationally representative. Without the weights, your analysis will run, but the results will only tell you about the sample you included in your analysis. They will not tell you about the population the sample was drawn to represent. Ignoring the weights misses out on what makes the PATH study so unique, the fact that it is nationally representative. The weights adjust for variable probabilities of selection, differential response rates, and possible deficiencies in the sample frame. A second consequence of the complex sample design is that you must use appropriate variance estimation procedures to account for sampling design factors, such as the stratification of PSUs and the use of oversampling, non-response adjustment, and calibration to control totals. Without using the correct method to estimate variance, your standard errors will be incorrect, and your ability to detect statistically significant results may be compromised. Generally, your confidence intervals would be larger, and you may miss significant results. If you were to run an unweighted regression model, you would need to include all of these components, stratification, clustering, oversampling, as covariates in your model. Instead, you can let the weights do this for you. This webinar is not a deep dive into sampling statistics or weighting. However, for those who are interested, Chapter 5 of the PATH Study User Guide describes computation of the weights. You can access the PATH Study User Guides under the For Researchers section of the main PATH Study Series page, located at https://doi.org/SERIES606. Replication variance estimation is the preferred method for estimating variances from PATH study data, and the data files include replicate weights for this purpose. Replication variance methods produce consistent estimators of variance for commonly used statistics, such as means and percentages, as well as regression coefficients, including linear, logistic, and Poisson regression. The basic idea behind replication is in its name. A subsample is selected from the whole sample, and the statistic of interest is calculated for the subsample. This is repeated or replicated many times, and then the replicate statistics are used to estimate the variance of the full sample statistic. There are different ways of creating the subsamples. Which method is used is based on the type of sample design. For the PATH study, the method that was selected is called the Balanced Repeated Replication (BRR) method. Specifically, the PATH study employs a variant of BRR known as phase method. More information about phase method is available in the user guide. BRR variance estimation is available in both SAS and Stata software. R does not have core programs that do survey data analysis. There are various contributed packages to R, such as the survey package, that analyze data from complex surveys and handle replication methods for variance estimation. SPSS Complex Samples currently does not offer BRR or other forms of replication-based estimation. Another method for adjusting for complex survey designs is linearization or Taylor series linearization. This approach does not account for calibrating the weights to control totals. Although information needed by this method, pseudostrata and pseudo-PSUs, are included on the data files, linearization is not the recommended method for PATH study data. Regardless of analytic technique used, always use full sample and replicate weights to get appropriate measures for estimates and standard errors, given the complex study design. Analytic techniques can become more complex as additional waves of longitudinal data become available. Next, we are going to talk about the types of PATH study weights for interview data. The PATH study conducts interviews with adult and youth respondents at each primary interview wave, for example, Wave 1, Wave 2, Wave 3, Wave 4, and Wave 5. On occasion, the PATH study will collect data from a special subgroup of respondents. These special data collection waves, which occur between primary waves, are named based on the primary waves they fall between. For example, wave 4.5. This webinar will focus on wave 1 through wave 5 primary interview waves and weights available to date. Future primary interview waves may include additional weights. Future webinars will discuss special data collections, biomarker data, etc., and the weights that are available when using those data sets. There are 3 types of weights available in the PATH study: cross-sectional, single wave, and all waves weights. Cross-sectional weights are created only for waves at which a new cohort was formed. Each respondent will have a cross-sectional weight at that wave. For example, all wave 1 respondents in the wave 1 cohort. Single wave weights were created for each wave after the formation of a cohort. They are only assigned to those respondents who participated in the first wave of the cohort, regardless of their participation in other waves. For example, only participants completing an interview at wave 1 and wave 5 received a wave 5 single wave weight for the wave 1 cohort. Single wave weights can be used for pseudo-cross-sectional or longitudinal analyses. All waves weights were created starting with the second wave after the formation of a cohort, for example, wave 3 for the wave 1 cohort. These are assigned to respondents who also responded at all previous waves relevant to the cohort. These weights are used for longitudinal analyses only. This table provides the weight variables for each wave, cohort, weight type, and interview type, excluding special data collections. At wave 1, there are only cross-sectional weights. At wave 2, there are only single wave weights. Starting at wave 3, there are both single wave and all waves weights. Wave 4 is the first time all 3 weight types are available. There are both single wave and all wave weights for the wave 1 cohort, but there are also cross-sectional weights for the wave 4 cohort. By wave 5, there are 2 sets of single wave weights, one for the wave 1 cohort, the other for the wave 4 cohort, and all wave weights for the wave 1 cohort only. All wave weights are not needed for the wave 4 cohort until wave 6. We will discuss these weight types in more detail next. Weight variables are included on the files with the questionnaire data for wave 1 and wave 2. For all other waves, these variables are on separate files corresponding to the respective wave, cohort, weight type, and interview type. Wave 1 is the inaugural recruitment wave for the wave 1 cohort. Since it is the first wave, there is only one set of weights for adults and one set for youth. Set refers to the full sample weight plus the 100 replicate weights. Since this is the recruitment wave, the weights are true cross-sectional weights. They were weighted to the population at the time of wave 1. If you calculated weighted estimates using the wave 1 data, those estimates are representative of the non-institutionalized civilian U.S. population aged 12 or older at the time of wave 1. Adding a replenishment sample marks the creation of a wave 4 cohort. There is a lot but not 100% overlap between those in the wave 1 cohort and those in the wave 4 cohort. See slide 8 for an illustration. But the creation of another cohort means more weights. Separate weights are needed for the wave 1 cohort and for the wave 4 cohort. The longitudinal design of the study means that the wave 1 cohort is followed at wave 2 and beyond. Even though the design is longitudinal, the single wave weights at wave 2, wave 3 for the wave 1 cohort, and wave 5 for the wave 4 cohort can be considered pseudo-cross-sectional weights. The single wave weights for the wave 1 cohort are calibrated back to the wave 1 population, since they are following the wave 1 cohort over time. However, since major changes in the civilian, non-institutionalized population are not expected over a 1 or 2 year period, the single wave weights at waves 2, 3, and 5 can be used for pseudo-cross-sectional analysis. Interpreting the single wave weight at wave 2, wave 3, and wave 5 is similar for the statement used at wave 1. Just swap in approximate and the wave of interest. The weighted data allow these estimates to approximate the non-institutionalized civilian U.S. population age 12 or older at the time of that wave. For example, pseudo-cross-sectional analyses of the wave 4 cohort at wave 5 could be described as approximating the non-institutionalized civilian U.S. population age 12 or older at the time of wave 5 who were in the civilian non-institutionalized population at wave 4. The single wave weights can also be used for longitudinal analyses between the inaugural wave for a cohort, wave 1 for the wave 1 cohort and wave 4 for the wave 4 cohort, and subsequent waves, irrespective of their participation in the interim waves. For example, wave 1 to wave 3 analysis, irrespective of their participation in wave 2. Weighted estimates are representative of the resident U.S. population other than those who are incarcerated at the time of insert subsequent wave here, who were in the civilian non-institutionalized population at insert inaugural cohort wave here. If you are interested in change over multiple waves, you need to use the all waves weight. For example, if your analysis is interested in what happens between wave 1 and wave 5, including all the waves in between, then you would need to use the all waves weights. However, in order to be included in the analysis, participants must have responded in all waves of interest. The weighted data allow these estimates to approximate the non-institutionalized civilian U.S. population age 12 or older at the time of that wave. For example, longitudinal analysis of the wave 1 cohort at wave 5 could be described as representative of the resident U.S. population at the time of wave 5 who were in the civilian non-institutionalized population at wave 1. So how do you determine which weight is correct for your analysis? This table provides a description of the weights available for each primary wave by cohort, including which analysis type they are suitable for and who the weights are assigned to. This table is current as of February 2022. Note that youth selected in the shadow sample at wave 1 do not have this weight available with the data files because they did not complete a wave 1 interview and have no data available for longitudinal analysis involving wave 1 and any later wave. The single wave weight serves as a pseudo cross-sectional weight for the interim waves. For example, wave 2, wave 3, wave 5. Prior to the formation of a new cohort. This table excludes special data collection waves and weights. In order to help select the correct weights for your analysis, the next set of slides will utilize this decision tree chart, also available in the user guide. The first step in the diagram is to determine if your analysis is longitudinal, within person, or cross-sectional. For all subsequent examples, we will assume the analysis is among adults 18 years and older. First, let's take a look at a cross-sectional analysis example. Cross-sectional analyses offer a snapshot in time, either at a single wave or multiple waves. Let's take a look at the decision tree to determine which weights to use for a single wave cross-sectional analysis. To answer the question, what is the prevalence of cigarette use at wave 4, you would conduct a cross-sectional analysis. Because wave 4 is the first wave of a new cohort, you would use the cases in the new cohort and the cross-sectional weights provided with the data. This is considered a true cross-sectional analysis. Here are a couple additional examples of research questions that would require a true cross-sectional analysis and the weights needed for them. First, to answer what is the association between cigar use and cardiovascular disease at wave 1, use the wave 1 cross-sectional weights for the wave 1 cohort. Second, to answer what is the association between dual ends and cigarette use and lifetime asthma diagnosis at wave 4, use the wave 4 cross-sectional weights for the wave 4 cohort. Likewise, to answer the question, what is the prevalence of cigarette use at wave 5, you would want to conduct a cross-sectional analysis. However, because wave 5 is not the first wave of a new cohort, there are no cross-sectional weights available. In order to pursue this pseudo-cross-sectional analysis, you would use the cases in the newest cohort and the single wave weight, which in this example is the wave 5 single wave weight for the wave 4 cohort. Here are a couple additional examples of research questions that would require a pseudo-cross-sectional analysis and the weights needed for them. To answer what is the association between cigar use and cardiovascular disease at wave 2, use the wave 2 single wave weights for the wave 1 cohort. To answer what is the association between dual ends and cigarette use and lifetime asthma diagnosis at wave 5, use the wave 5 single wave weights for the wave 4 cohort. Longitudinal analysis allows researchers to track changes over time. When considering what weights to use for longitudinal analysis, there are two options, the single wave weights and the all wave weights. We already talked about how the single wave weights are also appropriate for pseudo-cross-sectional analyses, and that remains true. But they can also be used for longitudinal analysis. Choosing between the single wave and the all waves weights will depend on which waves you are interested in analyzing. However, if you are interested in wave 2 or analyzing the wave 4 cohort at wave 5, the single wave weight is the only option for longitudinal analysis. Let's take a look at the decision tree to determine which weights to use for a longitudinal analysis. This figure is from the user guide. It does include information on special collection waves, like wave 4.5. Future webinars will discuss special collections and the weights that are available when using those datasets. To answer the question, is there an association between dual cigarette and e-cigarette use at wave 1 and no cigarette use at wave 3, irrespective of wave 2, you would do a longitudinal analysis. Because this question seeks to analyze an outcome for individuals at wave 3, relative to the first wave of the cohort only, you would need to use the wave 3 single wave weight for the wave 1 cohort. Here are a couple additional examples of research questions that would require a longitudinal analysis using single wave weights. The single wave weight allows you to assess change between the inaugural wave of a cohort and the current wave. To examine the association between tobacco use at wave 1 and lung cancer diagnosis at wave 5, irrespective of waves 2, 3, and 4, use the wave 5 single wave weight for the wave 1 cohort. To examine the association between tobacco use at wave 4 and lung cancer diagnosis at wave 5, use the wave 5 single wave weight for the wave 4 cohort. Let's look back at our previous longitudinal analysis example, but include wave 2 in the analysis. Is there an association between dual cigarette and e-cigarette use at waves 1 and 2 with no cigarette use at wave 3? First, you would identify the cohorts of interest. In this case, it is the wave 1 cohort. However, because the research question in this example is interested in multiple waves and not just a wave 1 and wave 3 analysis, you would use the wave 3 all waves weight for the wave 1 cohort. Here are a couple additional examples of research questions that would require a longitudinal analysis using all waves weights. An example of examining change across wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, and wave 4 might ask, what is the association between tobacco use at waves 1, 2, 3, and 4 with lung cancer diagnosis at wave 5? Or, for tracking changes from wave 3 to 4, what is the association between tobacco use at wave 3 and lung cancer diagnosis at wave 4? Note that when interested in change between interim waves and the present wave, the all waves weight is the appropriate weight. In order to interpret longitudinal estimates of change over time, remember that estimates are always interpreted with respect to the population at the time of wave 1 or wave 4 when the cohort was recruited. So, any analysis using either the wave 4 single wave or all waves weights for the wave 1 cohort can be interpreted as Weighted estimates that are representative of the resident U.S. population aged 12 and older at the time of Wave 4, other than those who were incarcerated, who were in the civilian, non-institutionalized population aged 9 or older at Wave 1. This table provides all the weights available for the Wave 1 and Wave 4 cohorts at each wave. Outlined in red are those you can use for cross-sectional and pseudo-cross-sectional analyses at Waves 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. In summary, if you are interested in Wave 1 or Wave 4, the true cross-sectional weight can be used for true cross-sectional analysis. On the other hand, if you are interested in other waves, Waves 2, 3, 4, or 5, then single wave weights for the specific cohort will allow for pseudo-cross-sectional analysis. For Waves 2, 3, and 4, use single wave weights for the Wave 1 cohort. For Wave 5, use the single wave weights for the Wave 4 cohort. In summary, longitudinal analysis is used for analyzing data from the Wave 1 cohort over time or the Wave 4 cohort over time. All waves weights are used for analyzing change between the inaugural wave and subsequent waves for those respondents who participated in the interim waves. Single wave weights are used for analyzing change between the inaugural wave for the cohort and a subsequent follow-up wave, irrespective of participation in the interim waves. Looking ahead, future webinars will focus on the application of biomarker and special data collection wave weights. Information about biomarker weights can be found in the Path Study Biomarker Restricted Use Files user guide. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have about Path Study data. You may send your questions via email to pathdataUserQuestions@westat.com.